Murdorf and the Mortal Flaw, Book 1, Chapter 24, Boden. When the riders stepped outside, their feet sank beneath the accumulated snow. The boots were hardly tall enough to avoid being overtopped by the drifts. As Zorgar opened the door to leave, he released the bellowing voice of his wife. "There's not enough fire for the winter." Zorgar scurried out the door, trying to conceal the fight he and his wife were having. Playing it cool, he yelled back at the closed door, "I love you too, dear." Windsor and Novatian met up outside the door and started to walk off to meet the others at the barn when his wife opened the door and yelled, "There's not enough firewood." Zorgar ignored her and kept walking. "There's enough firewood for 3 winters," he said to his comrades. "Don't go," she yelled. Zorgar kept walking, knowing he had a duty to fulfill. "What if you don't come back?" she yelled, her voice cracking with emotion. Zorgar stopped dead in his tracks and turned back towards his wife. Suddenly his ego didn't matter anymore. He knew she had a reason to be fearful. It really wasn't about the firewood. He walked back to her, wrapped his arms around her and kissed her. She wept. "It's going to be a long and cold winter without you," she said. Zorgar held her tight and then kissed her goodbye. "I'll come back," he said, knowing it wasn't a promise he could swear by. "There's nowhere I'd rather be than with you and the children, but this is an important mission." He kissed her again and gave her a reassuring hug. A herd of little Vikings ran around in the snow, throwing snowballs and tumbling into flaky mounds. Boys threw snowballs while little girls almost got lost beneath the sprawling white carpet. Chains of smoke rose up from the chimneys in a feeble effort to stay warm. "Bye, Father," little Vikings said in succession, as Zorgar grabbed them one by one and gave them a big hug. There must have been one for every year he and his wife had been married. "Mind your mother," he said sternly. When they reached the barn, he shimmied up on his woolly mammoth. The expanding group set out towards the tomb of Murdorf. But first they paused and took one last look over the great fjords. Pearly mountains glistened with hues of orange beneath the bursting sunrise. The fiery ball of light rose in the east, casting its brilliant light upon the waters, mountains, and glaciers. The mighty floating ice caps sparkled like topaz set in a ring of sapphire. The sublime beauty was almost blinding to look at, but they looked anyway, taking in the majesty of the moment. Treading a path down the Ibian mountains, the riders made new tracks, traveling east. Nadora was now on her own mount, and Novatian missed having her arms wrapped around him, not only because he liked having her near him, but now his backside was exposed and he could feel the wind. The snowbound mountains made the terrain challenging and the journey slow. Their bodies quickly grew bitterly cold, their fingers numb, and they slowly trudged over the difficult glaciated terrain, wind gales blowing against their faces. They traveled all day in the freezing temperatures, hunkered down beneath their shoulders of the mounts in a futile attempt to find a hint of warmth. The day was long and miserable. Gilgor's large body plowed through the woodland, his head and shoulders knocking snow from the icy limbs of the sculpted trees showering the ground. The sun faded in and out, and at times it looked like it might snow again, but for now the sky was fit to hold on to frozen moisture. When night drew near, the riders cleared a parcel of land in the snow, with a little help from the fire-breathing friends, and made camp. They gathered wood and made a small fire. It wasn't long before Gilgor began to complain about the size of the fire and insisted on making it bigger. "I can't even warm my hands, it's so small," complained Gilgor. Gathering more wood, he made a giant-sized fire, more suitable for warming his oversized body. Huddling close to the gigantic fire, the riders roasted a couple of geese they bagged along the way. After eating, they crowded their bedrolls nearly on top of one another, trying to no avail to get warm. Silence blanketed the ice-bound highlands, except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional howling of wolves. They awoke at the crack of dawn, covered in snow and shivering, but remarkably the fire was still simmering. With chattering teeth they gathered their belongings and trudged across the snowbound mountains. Hungry, they wished for a moose, and almost had it, but Zorgar missed the shot when the bull darted away. The journey over the Ibians was difficult. The travel was cumbersome and the climate harsh. Their fingers and toes remained stiff and their cheeks red and chapped. 3 days into the ride, Gilgore heard a noise just beyond the snow-drenched trees. Stopping, he listened. "Shh! Did you hear that?" Gilgore asked. "Oh, it's probably just a branch breaking from the weight of the snow," Medora said. Fleece flipped his lucky medallion. "Something's out there," he said. Vandorf rolled his eyes and bit his tongue, trying not to say anything. Ignoring the noise, the riders traveled on, but Gilgore couldn't shake the feeling that somehow someone was watching. He looked over his shoulder, doing a retake every time he thought he heard something. The next day, they were riding along the banks of a frozen river, hunkered down over their beast and bundled up in their coats of fur in a feeble effort to keep warm. A peculiar noise nagged Gilgore, his hearing a little keener than the others. Looking over his shoulder, Gilgore caught a glimpse of something moving beyond the frosty, decorated trees. "Hey, there's something out there." "It's following us," said Gilgore. "Oh, come on, Gilgore. It's probably just a wolf or something," Vandorf said. "Yeah, I suppose you're right." "There's something out there," Fleece assured them, still flipping his medallion in his pocket and getting a consistent reading every time. Vandorf ignored him once again, but his patience was wearing thin. Seizing the moment to play on Gilgore's jumpy nerves, Zorgar just couldn't help himself. It seemed a perfect opportunity for a practical joke, especially with the snowdrifts that form along the side of the banks of the rocky cliffs as they ride past. Inconspicuously falling behind the riders, Zorgar suddenly toppled out of his saddle and into a mound of snow and completely buried him. "Oh, oh, get off, get it off, get it off!" He screamed like he was dying. Stupefied, the riders turned back, trying to figure out what was happening. Instinctively, they grabbed their swords and rushed to Zorgar's aid. Zorgar yelled and gasped for his life beneath the lump of powder. Gilgore moved in close, prepared to dive into the snow, when suddenly Zorgar arose from the snow, laughing hysterically. "It's a snow elf!" he yelled, laughing. His beard, mangy hair, and long eyebrows captured the snow, refusing to let go of a single flake. It took a moment for the riders to realize that Zorgar was up to no good. As he fell over, rolling with laughter, Gilgore, livid with anger, stepped back to reevaluate the situation. When he did, his foot crushed through the snow and settled on Zorgar's hand, pinning it beneath the snow and to the ground. "Oh!" yelled Zorgar. "This time for real?" But no one believed him. "You're on my fingers!" Zorgar finally convinced Gilgore, and he lifted his big foot. Now Zorgar wasn't the one laughing. He held his hand and then tried to shake out the pain. Then, before he had a chance to jump up, Gilgore wrapped his brawny arms around a tree and shook it, burying Zorgar in the mountain of snow. He left him to dig his own self out. "Could we rest for just a short while as Dumbbutt here digs himself out?" asked Gilgore. "Sure," said Windsor. "Let's walk ahead over these rocks to the edge of the river." Gilgore and Windsor pulled out their pipes and stuffed them with tobacco. Medora trudged through the snow to lead Orpa over to the frozen river so the dragon could thaw the solid waters with the heat of her fire in order that all the beasts could drink. Vandorf walked with her, making polite conversation, some political in nature. "Why don't we go ahead and set up camp here for the night?" Windsor suggested. "Looks like a good spot as any," Nimri said. "I'll start gathering some firewood." Eager to please, Fleece began to gather kindling too, reaching beneath the snow wherever he saw something that looked remotely like a piece of wood. As he strolled around searching for anything that would burn, he heard a rustling in the woods. He looked over his shoulder this way and then that, but he didn't see anyone. A nagging notion that someone was watching him formed in his gut. With his arms full of timber, he carried it back to the campsite. Nimri gathered a few logs along the edge of the river, and together they had a worthy pile. But Gilgore didn't think so. He brought a few more just to make sure the fire was big enough. Then Orpa gushed out a series of blasting fire and dried up the moisture of the branches and created warming embers of fire. It was as they were sitting around the fire, Windsor and Gilmore puffing on their pipes, that a mangy monster-like giant crept out of the snowbound forest. It was the warmth of the fire that drew him out. When the riders noticed him, it scared them half to death. He stood tall, and his hair long, and a long beard that looked like an ice sculpture dangled from his head and his face. His huge feet flattened everything in his path as he stumbled towards them. Even Gilmore was taken back by the appearance of the giant. At first sight, Gilmore dropped his large pipe on his arm, knocking out his hot tobacco and burning himself. Startled by the monstrous giant, Medora and Vendorf stepped back several steps onto the frozen river, now softened by the blast of fire delivered by the dragons. The thawing ice cracked beneath their feet, and they plunged into the glacial water. The bitter cold waters took their breath away. Novation ran to pull Medora and Vendorf out of the frigid waters. As the monster came curiously near them, Gilmore stood up and stepped towards it. When the monster saw Gilmore stand up, it froze. It stared at the giant, grunting as he sized him up. They could see sorrow in his eyes. He stared at the fire and at them as though he wished to join them. After a few moments, he turned and ran away into the woods, leaving behind huge footprints in the snow. Vendorf and Medora clung to an ice-covered rock at the edge of the river, paralyzed with cold, their hands nearly frozen to the rock. Novation was pulling Medora out, and Zorgar had a firm grip on Vendorf. "Hurry, get them over to the fire," yelled Windsor. Novation pulled dry clothes from their bags, fearful that they might perish from cold. "They need to change clothes," he said, handling them dry clothes. "Do you need help?" he asked Medora, smiling. Rolling her freezing eyes at him, she snatched her clothes from her arms with her club-like hands. "I think I can manage," her teeth chattering as she tried to speak. Gilmore stood up with his coat up in the air and his back turned to provide a makeshift privacy curtain for Medora as she clumsily changed her clothes. Ice droplets had formed on Vandorf's ponytail. The cold made it hard to breathe. Like a pair of ice sculptures, the two stood motionless, now one with the glaciated background. The heat was beginning to help, though. As night fell, the riders sat around the bonfire, Windsor, Gamons, and Vendorf puffing on their pipes. The heat of the fire licked up the water from their wet clothes and drenched boots that hung beside it. Vendorf, perturbed that his boots had gotten soaking wet, frequently felt of them, anxious for them to dry so he could polish them. Under the moonlight, the riders looked up to see the giant monster sitting on a large rock watching them. "I told you I saw something," Gilmore said. "Me too," Fliss injected. Vendorf gave Fliss a look that could have killed. "This is going to be a long trip," Vendorf said with a sigh of disgust. "Who is he?" Medora asked, granting personhood to the creature. "His name is Boden," Gilmore replied, taking a greedy draw on his pipe. "He was a normal giant once, then he lost his mind. It was after the war with Darvan and his hordes of Quadar. Boden was just never the same after that," Gilmore explained. "You mean you knew him?" Novation asked. "Oh, yes, grew up with him. Nice enough fellow, that is, until the war. I don't know what happened. He was captured. No one knows exactly what he went through, but he returned home all crazy-like. He couldn't handle civilization, so he ran off into the mountains. Some say that Darvan cursed him, others that he just lost his mind. Occasionally he is spotted. Pitiful it is. Figured he was dead by now." "Perhaps we should try to help him," Medora offered, always compassionate for those in need. "In what way?" Vendorf considered as he wiped down his gear between long draws on his pipe. "Well, maybe we could try to befriend him and offer him the warmth of the fire," suggested Medora. "Look at him. He looks so sad and cold, so miserable and lonely," said Medora. "Would you like to be the one to walk over there and ask him if he would care to join us?" Zorgar asked, laughing. Medora opened her mouth and then closed it without saying a word. After a moment, she dropped the blanket she had wrapped around her, stood up, and squared her shoulders. "Medora, don't go over there," Novation cried. "Zorgar didn't mean it as a challenge." No, not at all. I was just saying that I wouldn't do that if I were you," said Zorgar. Medora started to walk slowly towards the giant. "She's bloody crazy." Nimri said he couldn't believe the boldness of this gal. Medora, what are you doing? Get over here, come back. Novation had risen now and was walking beside her, trying to convince her of the insanity of this. Go back over there, I know what I'm doing, she assured him. He tried further, begging and demanding, but finally grew frustrated at her usual hard-headedness. She came to a standstill in short distance from the giant. From there she extended an invitation. Come join us. You are welcome to sit around the fire and get warm. She motioned for him to follow her. The giant looked strangely at her, turning his head to one side as though he didn't understand her. Come join us, she repeated. Come on, you can get warm by the fire. She waved her hands, motioning for him to follow her. The giant stood up and grunted at Medora. He stepped towards her. She felt her heart race and thought she felt tremors in the earth beneath her with each step he made. The giant lumbered behind her, gazing suspiciously at them. Boden slowly moved towards the riders, then hesitated before sitting on the ground beside them. Stretching out her hands to the fire, Medora spoke to him. It's warm. Feels good, doesn't it? Boden stretched his hands to the fire, mimicking her. There was an awkward silence. Then all began to talk quietly among themselves. Boden seemed to be enjoying both the fire and the company. The smile on his face proved that this was a better moment than many he had experienced in his lifetime. Shortly the ice that hung on the giant's beard and long matted hair began to melt, forming a pool of water beneath the icy monster as he thought. He even seemed to be warming up to them. Sitting down, he looked like he could drift off to sleep any minute now. Now Gilgore tried to communicate. Boden, you're Boden, aren't you? The giant's sleepy eyes looked at Gilgore as though he recognized the name Boden. I remember you, Gilgore said. The giant didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told Gilgore that he was right. The giant grinned, showing his rotting teeth. The warmth of the fire began to comfort the giant, and before long he slumped over and nodded off into a hypnotic sleep. His dirty head hung down with his raggedy clothes. Before long he was snoring. He slept for a while, but woke up when he heard one of the riders stand up and laugh out loud. Darvan is going to be on his toes if he knows where the sword was found, Novation said. Hearing the name Darvan, Boden's countenance changed, his face becoming twisted with fear. Darvan, he grunted. Darvan, he cried out, his voice rising each time he repeated the words. Standing up, he now yelled it, Darvan. The giant's face grew fierce. He stepped back, wrapped his large hands around one of the small timbers and began to shake the tree, shouting Darvan's name over and over. Snow fell as if snow had blown in. He shook the tree until its roots began to pop. Darvan, Darvan, he yelled, and then he ran away through the woods. The riders sat frozen in fright. They had watched him go from a sleeping giant to an angry madman. I wish there were something we could do for him, said Vandorf. Me too, said Gilgore with resignation. There is, Windsor reminded them. We can fulfill our mission. Yeah, you're right, Vandorf agreed. I suppose all we can do is get retribution for the poor fellow. Maybe after this mission you can take him back to your land, Medora said to Gilgore, offering a solution. No one should have to live like he's living. Felice agreed, but he wanted a quicker solution to the problem. Isn't there something that we can do now to help him? Well, I don't know. Why don't you flip that silly coin of yours and see what it suggests? Vandorf couldn't keep a lid on it any longer. He's lived out here for years now. There's nothing we can do right now for him, Windsor said. We can't bring him on a mission like this. The riders snuggled near the fire and drifted off to sleep. When they awoke in the morning, they could see the scruffy giant sitting curiously on the same rock he'd been sitting on the night before. As they sipped on their coffee, they spoke further about the peculiar giant. Vandorf polished his damp boots as he sipped his morning brew, then cringed as he stuck his feet into the freezing cold and still wet boots. The riders gathered their belongings, mounted their beasts, and continued towards the tomb of Murdorf. As they rode over the mountains, they occasionally spotted Boden. He followed them at a safe distance across the Ibian mountains. His beard and hair again took the shape of an ice sculptor. He looked cold and lonely, a miserable soul lost in a complicated world, lost within himself. The legs of the mounts rose and fell with effort as they trudged through dense blankets of snow. The hallowed sanctuary of the gods was losing its appeal quickly for the riders. They wondered if their frozen fingers and toes would ever thaw. As they crossed the river, they spied the lonely giant. He had followed them down the mountain, icicles dangling from his beard as they watched the rider cross the river and disappear. As darkness approached, they reached the open plains. They rode on with the light of Windsor's orb and a couple of torches expunging a slither of darkness. Meanwhile, the riders in the east sat at the tomb of Murdorf, waiting and wondering. Navi gazed into his orb, but he was unable to tell where in the world they were.